You are a Praetorian Guard in Rome. The year is 220 AD, and your hands tremble as screams echo from the imperial chambers. You protected 3 emperors. You have survived countless battles. You've seen men die in every conceivable way. But nothing prepared you to serve a 14-year-old child who brought adult senators to tears of horror. The heavy doors creak open. The emperor appears in silk robes that cost more than a legion's salary. Her face was painted with cosmetics, and she wore religious symbols twisted around her neck. But it's her eyes that send chills down your spine. An innocent cruelty that only a child could possess. One that no one says no to. One that has never learned that other people feel pain. Behind her, servants carry blood-stained silks and broken jewels. Items once worn by people who believed their noble birth would protect them. You learned that the screams eventually stopped. The silence that follows is even worse. What you don't know is that this child will become the most immoral ruler who ever lived. His 4-year reign would involve more systematic cruelty than that of emperors who ruled for decades. By the time the guards decide to say enough is enough, Roman civilization itself will be decaying. But this nightmare is getting worse. Much worse. If you enjoy learning hidden truths about history before delving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, you might consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please leave a comment below to let me know where you listen to it. His birth name was Varius Avatus Bassianisti, but the world would know him as Elagabalus, the priest of the Syrian sun god. He was born in 204 AD. The empire carried a genetic poison that had been brewing in its bloodlines for generations. Her mother, Julia Soaemias, possessed boundless ambition and complete moral flexibility. The Syria in which he grew up horrified the traditional Romans. Ancient cults practiced sacred prostitution, gender reassignment ceremonies, and human sacrifice rituals disguised as religious devotion. The child learned that, as an instrument of God, normal rules did not apply to him. That pleasure is divinely ordained, and that inflicting pain on others is an act of worship. What truly shaped the monster was the complete absence of someone to say no. From his earliest memories, people vied to fulfill his every wish. The maids cleaned up the tantrums without complaining. Teachers praised the brutal games as natural leadership. The family saw her intelligence and beauty as tools for political advantage. When she turned 10, tears brought her everything. At age 12, violence yielded quicker results. By the time the Roman throne became vacant at the age of 14, he had mastered the art of using people as objects of amusement. But the conspiracy that put him on the throne reveals something truly chilling about the people who enabled his rise to power. Caracalla's assassination in 217 AD created an opportunity. The reigning emperor, Magrinus, was unpopular because he had increased luxury while cutting soldiers' salaries. Julia Soaemias made Caracalla the legitimate heir by spreading rumors that her son was Caracalla's illegitimate child. It turned out to be a lie. Elagabalus was unlike anyone else. The timelines didn't match. But soldiers seeking better pay relied on faith, not truth. Julia Soaemias had bought the loyalty of key commanders by stealing temple gold. Here's something that will chill your blood. This wasn't just about putting a young man on the throne. Julia Soaemias had observed her son's developing character, his random cruelty, and his calculating mind. He knew exactly which monster he had unleashed. The letters she wrote to her supporters reveal a woman who viewed her son's immorality not as a problem, but as a political issue. He promised the commanders unrestricted looting. He assured the priests that their gods would rule Rome. He spoke to traders about the regulations that had been lifted, but he never mentioned what the child wanted, what he dreamed of during the Syrian temple nights, or how he imagined larger ceremonies with himself at the center while watching the sacrificial rituals. The Battle of Antioch in 218 AD was more of a political collapse than a military conflict. When Macrinus arrived with his loyal troops, he discovered that most of the eastern legions had already switched sides to the claimant to the throne. Loyal soldiers were quickly subdued through excessive bribery. Macron died while fleeing to Rome. His head was cut off and sent to the young man who now claimed imperial power. Elagabalus received the news while performing his morning rituals at the temple of the sun god. Witnesses described a scene that should have been triumphant, but instead felt deeply disturbing. The 14-year-old boy, dressed in silk robes that mixed imperial purple with religious gold, smiled when the severed head of his predecessor was displayed. But it wasn't the smile of a victorious general. It was the satisfied expression of a child who had received a particularly fun toy. His first act as emperor was to order the heads of Macrinus's supporters to be displayed around the temple. The second demand was that the captured prisoners be brought before him for individual trial. What happened afterward formed the pattern that would define his reign. Instead of swift executions or merciful pardons, Elagabalus created elaborate games in which prisoners could win their freedom by participating in increasingly humiliating competitions. The games started innocently enough. Captured officers were forced to race around the temple complex while carrying heavy stones. The winners received freedom and gold. The losers faced execution. But as the young emperor watched these events unfold, something darker dawned on him. They started adding new rules, changes that have nothing to do with military tradition, but are entirely related to a growing fascination with violating human dignity. Soon, the races included obstacles requiring participants to crawl through mud mixed with animal waste. Then came the requirement for the losers to submit to physical punishments that became more creative and more intense with each iteration. Instead of recognizing these as signs of burgeoning sadism, Syrian priests encouraged them as expressions of religious creativity. Those who resisted these new amusements were not executed in dramatic fashions, but were quietly removed and never mentioned again. But this was just the beginning. The journey to Rome would give Elagabalus time to experiment with absolute power and develop an appetite that would make the Syrian games seem like child's amusement. The march on Rome turned into a vibrant carnival of depravity that shocked even the hardened soldiers. Elagabalus traveled in an elaborate stretcher, carried by slaves chosen for their beauty, not their strength. He discovered that beautiful people enhance divine perfection. He viewed human attractiveness as a resource to be gathered and consumed. Each city offered its finest young citizens as tribute. Not hostages, not volunteers, just human decorations for a mobile entertainment palace. Boys and girls, torn from their families for the amusement of an emperor who wasn't even a teenager yet. What happened during those nights of travel was whispered in letters between the governors. The emperor's tent was larger than the houses and was divided into rooms serving different purposes. The religious shrines where Syrian rituals were performed were mixed with creative additions. Bedrooms where he entertained himself with beautiful captives. The most disturbing rooms were those reserved for training sessions. The 14-year-old boy collected the tributes and explained their new roles in divine service to them. Not talk about the mission itself, but detailed explanations of what to expect, both intimately and spiritually, when they arrive in Rome. The government was issuing comprehensive instructions on the organized humiliation of a child who lacked formal education. Those who disappointed him or resisted him didn't simply disappear. They were quietly escorted away from the traveling court and never mentioned again. The imperial guards learned that not questioning empty tents or dwindling tribute numbers was a survival strategy in itself. But what awaited them in Rome would make the horrors of the journey seem like mere training exercises. For centuries, the Palatine Palace had been filled with the echoes of Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius. Months after Elagabalus's arrival, it was unrecognizable. His first priority was not management, but redesigning the living space for divine ceremonies. Traditional Roman religious sites were simple places that inspired respect and reverence. Elagabalus destroyed them. Instead, he created rooms that blended Syrian temple architecture with his own innovations. The new spaces featured altars carved with explicit scenes, walls painted with shocking imagery, and bespoke furniture, whose purpose became clear during specific rituals. Palace staff were divided into new categories that had nothing to do with traditional duties. Some were selected for their physical attractiveness. He was assigned to ceremonial service. Others were chosen out of common sense to preserve specialized equipment from Eastern artisans. A third group cleaned up after the parties and got rid of embarrassing evidence. The most worrying cases were the maids who simply disappeared after completing their assigned duties. There were no official executions. There was no crime or trial. He was only there for one day. He left the next day. The rooms had been reassigned as if they had never existed. But that's what made the palace truly terrifying. Elagabalus was not content with mere personal perversions. He began incorporating his experiments into official state functions. He forced senators, and foreign ambassadors to witness ceremonies that mixed government affairs with activities unprecedented in Roman history. A typical meeting with the emperor now involved amusements that would physically sicken even seasoned politicians. Foreign diplomats arriving for trade agreements found themselves watching performances involving palace slaves in scenarios deemed too risque to be officially recorded. Senators awaiting traditional meetings on legislative matters. Instead, they were forced to participate in religious ceremonies, where they had to choose between compromising their honor and being accused of disrespecting the emperor's divine authority. The most disturbing aspect was how systematically everything was organized. These were not spontaneous outbursts of madness, but carefully planned events with specific purposes. Elagabalus used genuine humiliation as a tool of political control. He broke the psychological resistance of the Roman elite by forcing them to participate in or witness activities that violated their deepest moral beliefs. Each ceremony was designed to test the limits of what people would accept rather than confront imperial discontent. The emperor will introduce the new elements gradually. He would carefully observe who showed signs of resistance, who showed complete surrender. Those who passed the tests were rewarded with golden political advancement and immunity from future tests. Those who failed simply disappeared. More compatible alternatives were introduced in their place. However, the emperor's appetite for innovation meant that even successful participants could never feel safe. Elagabalus was constantly developing new forms of entertainment, new ways of testing loyalty, and new methods of demonstrating his absolute power over the bodies and souls of his subjects. But something went wrong when Elagabalus decided that the available entertainment options weren't providing enough stimulation. The young emperor had exhausted the possibilities offered by the palace slaves and courtiers. It needed new victims, with higher risks involved. He turned his attention to Rome's noblest families and their children. Court agents were tasked with identifying the most beautiful sons and daughters of nobles throughout Rome. Lists were created that read like catalogs of potential victims. Detailed physical descriptions, information about family relationships that can be exploited for emotional leverage, and assessments of which families can be safely targeted. The first families to receive the imperial invitations immediately understood that these were not requests disguised as honors, but orders. Children were summoned to participate in religious ceremonies at the palace, with a clear implication that a refusal would result in accusations of disrespecting the emperor's divine authority. But accepting it meant sending their sons and daughters into an environment where previous participants had either emerged traumatized or hadn't emerged at all. Several senatorial families attempted to protect their children by sending them away from Rome or arranging marriages that would render them unsuitable for imperial service. However, Elagabalus had anticipated such resistance and declared that evading religious duties was a state crime in itself. Imperial guards were sent to bring back runaway children, and hastily arranged marriages were declared null and void by imperial decree. The psychological pressure on the Roman elite became unbearable as they faced impossible choices between protecting their children and protecting their own lives. Some families chose to abandon their properties and commemorate the day, rather than subjecting their sons and daughters to whatever the emperor planned. Others attempted to negotiate by offering gold or political support in exchange for the rare exemptions Elagabalus granted. But perhaps the most tragic were the families who convinced themselves that cooperation would protect them from worse fates, or that the suffering of their children was a necessary sacrifice for the survival of their families. These parents entrusted their sons and daughters to the palace ceremonies. Then they lived knowing that the traumatized children returned home forever changed. How normal this had become for the imperial palace. The newcomers were quickly trained by the surviving personnel about the emperor's expectations and the consequences of resistance. An informal system developed in which experienced courtiers informed newcomers about which behaviors were required, which were forbidden, and which were recommended for advancement. The emperor's appetite for ceremonies went beyond individual cases and escalated to group events involving dozens of young participants. These events were planned with military efficiency, requiring extensive preparation, specialized equipment, and careful coordination among court staff, who specialized in facilitating the emperor's most extravagant fantasies. Palace records from this period, discovered centuries later in archives that imperial successors attempted to destroy, reveal the systematic nature of these operations. And participant lists organized according to physical characteristics ceremony programs planned weeks in advance, equipment orders clarifying the planned activities for each event, and medical preparations to treat participants afterward. The most chilling of all are the reports submitted by court observers tasked with documenting the emperor's reforms for future reference. These narratives are written in a clinical language that barely conceals the author's horror. It describes ceremonies that push the boundaries of human cruelty and intimate perversion far beyond anything recorded in previous imperial reigns. However, Elagabalus made a critical mistake in his systematic humiliation of the Roman elite. By sacrificing the children of powerful families, he had created enemies who possessed both the motivation and the resources to destroy him. The same senators who had endured personal humiliation at court ceremonies drew a line in the sand, watching their own sons and daughters suffer similar fates. But the young emperor sealed his own fate when he announced he was planning his most ambitious ceremony yet. A week-long festival that will involve hundreds of participants from across the empire. It was designed to demonstrate the universal reach of divine authority and to satisfy appetites that grew beyond what the palace could provide. News of the planned festival reached potential victims throughout the Roman world. He created the catalyst needed for the conspirators to unite the opposition. Families who had previously yielded to his demands realized that the emperor's appetites had escalated beyond any possibility of satisfaction. Military commanders understood that such extreme behavior would eventually lead to rebellions that could tear the empire apart. Even the palace staff who had facilitated previous ceremonies began to understand that they were participants in something that threatened the very foundations of civilized society. The final shocking event came with a sudden turn of events. On March 11, 222 AD, while Elagabalus was performing his morning rituals, the Praetorian Guard entered and announced that he was no longer emperor. The boy who terrorized Rome for 4 years faced, in his final moments, the same snarling disbelief that characterized his entire reign. According to witnesses, Elagabalus's last words were not pleas for mercy or expressions of remorse, but complaints about the interruption of his divine ceremonies. Even when faced with death, he seemed incapable of understanding that his victims were human beings, not objects for his amusement. The guards quickly killed her along with her mother, Julia Soaemias. Then they dragged their bodies through the streets of Rome and threw them into the Tiber River. But the story doesn't end with the emperor's death, because the legacy of his reign would haunt Rome for generations. The systematic humiliation he inflicted created trauma that affected entire families and political networks. The children who survived the ceremonies grew into adults with a permanent disability that damaged their capacity to form normal relationships. Senators who participated in imperial entertainments carried a sense of shame that affected their political decisions for the rest of their careers. The new emperor, Alexander Severus, spent years trying to restore traditional Roman values and erase evidence of his predecessor's reign. The palace rooms were demolished and rebuilt. The records were destroyed or stored in archives. Personnel who had served Elagabalus were reassigned to distant provinces where their knowledge of imperial secrets would not contaminate the new administration. Yet the trauma persisted in ways that shaped Roman culture for decades. Families became more protective of their children, realizing that imperial favor could be more dangerous than imperial displeasure. The army developed new protocols for evaluating potential emperors. Religious practices have changed, because traditional Romans suspected Eastern influences that could enable such systematic deviance. Tragically, most of Elagabalus's victims never recovered from their experience. Historical records contain references to former palace slaves who spent the rest of their lives in religious seclusion. They were seeking spiritual healing for a trauma unprecedented in human experience. Noble families, influenced by imperial ceremonies, completely withdrew from public life, unable to participate in social activities that reminded them of their humiliation. As we reach the end of this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, we must confront disturbing truths about the nature of absolute power and human evil. Elagabalus was not unique because of his youth or his Eastern origins. It was unique because the conditions allowed the worst impulses to develop unchecked. Instead of satisfying appetites, it created a monster that grew through gratification. In today's age of concentrated power and covert networks of exploitation, the story of Elagabalus reminds us that the capacity for systematic evil has not disappeared from human nature. It lurks in the shadows of each generation, He seeks moments when conditions align to provide both motivation and the means. The children who suffered during palace ceremonies 2,000 years ago have long since turned to dust. But their suffering echoes through history. It reminds us that some forms of evil are so devastating that they are unforgettable. We remember them not to sensationalize their suffering, but to honor their humanity, and to ensure that the systems that enabled their victimization are recognized and resisted when they emerge. The young emperor who thought himself a god learned too late that even absolute power cannot protect those who confuse tyranny with might and depravity with divinity. His death in the streets of Rome served justice not only for specific crimes, but also for the greater crime of viewing people as expendable objects serving personal appetites. The most immoral emperor in history was truly only 14 years old when he began his reign of terror. However, age, combined with unlimited power and the complete absence of moral constraints, did not prevent systematic cruelty. Its legacy stands as an eternal testament to human capacity for resistance against both unimaginable evil and its dominion. If this look into the hidden darkness of history has inspired you to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video that just appeared on your screen to discover another shocking chapter that history has tried to erase. And if you found this discovery as fascinating as I did, hit the subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.